Alright, now we got to start talking about CSS selectors. It's an extremely important topic, but we're really just going to scratch kind of the tip of the iceberg right now. And in the next round of videos, next week, next module, we'll get much more into CSS selector, CSS specificity, some of the complexities of CSS. So I know you've seen me use a couple classes so far, but right now I cleaned out my whole HTML. So we've got nothing but regular HTML elements. Unordered list, list items, div, h1, paragraphs. No classes, no IDs, nothing fancy. Now this is what the page looks like. My unordered list and my list items are still a little bit formatted. Okay, but let me get rid of everything else. This is what we're dealing with. Now, let's say that I want to make my name is Evan bold. Well, we know that my name is Evan is contained in a paragraph element. So the first thing that we need to do to make it bold, first thing we need to do to change any kind of style in CSS is to select. We need to select what we're styling. Now I want to style this paragraph. So I'm going to select it with P. P, as you should remember, is simply the tag name. It's a P tag, it's a paragraph tag, it's written with a P. This is how we select it. And now I'm going to apply font weight bold as a CSS property. Reload my page, and my name is Evan has become bolded. Okay? I hope you notice, however, that welcome to my site has also become bolded. So the important thing that I want you to think about here, the important thing that I want you to ask yourself is, what is this P selecting? What is this P selecting? I'm going to tell you in a minute, but I want you to think about it. I want you to try to write to yourself in a comment, what is this P here selecting? Okay? Hope you gave it some thought. What this paragraph is selecting is not the paragraph element, not the paragraph on my website. It's selecting all paragraph elements in my HTML. If you're currently asking what's the difference between that and, say, this, the difference is in the language that you use to explain what this selector is selecting. It is important. It is crucial. It is critical. Right now, I'm going to be pretty insistent with you guys that you use a certain type of language to explain what CSS selectors are selecting. And it's not for my benefit. It's so that you drill into your brain an understanding of what is going to be affected by the styles which I write inside this selector. Okay? So just to review real quick, we should know how CSS selectors work, but we start with the selector. Select what you're styling. We add our curly braces. That's these guys here, the mustaches, sideways mustaches, if you will. And then between those curly braces, add the properties we want to change, then our colon, then the value we're changing that property to, and then the semicolon. Feels like a bit of a mouthful, all of it. But put another way, we use a selector, curly braces, property, colon, value, semicolon. Okay, this is the pattern for all CSS without exception. Selector, curly brace, property, colon, value, semicolon, closing curly brace. If you find yourself writing CSS like this, stop and fix it. If you find yourself writing CSS like this, stop and fix it. If you find yourself writing CSS like this, stop and fix it. Start being aware of your own bad habits so that you can deliberately fix them and take control of your own learning and your own advancement here. You can take responsibility for your code. All right, so we've selected all paragraph elements in our HTML with this selector. So now I ask you, what does this select? It selects all div elements in my HTML. Okay, it doesn't matter how many there are. Doesn't matter how many there are. That's a question for another time. I know that there's only one, but I never, ever want to hear any of you guys describe what this selector is selecting with the div element. That's a big no-no. It's not the div element, it's all div elements, any div elements. Okay? Now let's give all div elements on my page a background color of pink. Great. But back to the paragraphs. We used this paragraph selector and made all of our paragraphs bold, including one paragraph which we don't want to be bold. We just wanted this one to be bold. So what can I do to more specifically select this paragraph element as opposed to all paragraph elements? Well, this is an occasion where we can come into the HTML and use something like a class attribute. I'm going to give this paragraph a class of bold. Is that going to do anything? No. On its own, that class will do nothing. Now this class name, bold, I completely made it up. It could be anything I want. I could call it zebra. In fact, I'm going to do that. I'm going to give this paragraph a class of zebra. It means nothing to the computer. It doesn't care what your class name is. But now I can select this paragraph by this class name and make specifically this one bold. So let's go ahead and do that. Rather than use this paragraph selector, let's write a new selector which selects all elements with the class of zebra. And that will look like this. Dot zebra. Okay, dot followed by the class name. Dot class name. That is how we select elements by class names in CSS. And now that I have elements with the class of zebra selected, I'm going to make them all bold. Okay, and because I eliminated this paragraph selector, I commented it out, all my paragraphs now are not bold, but the elements which have the class of zebra are bold. And let's add zebra, the class of zebra, to one of my list items too. I'll add it to the one that says home because this feels like it's our home page. And watch what happens to home. Home is now bold. This paragraph is bold, and this list item is bold, because I'm no longer selecting selecting them by their element types. I'm selecting them by a class name, which they both seem to have. Okay? So this is called a class selector. Something like div or paragraph is called an element or type selector. Now finally, there are ID selectors. And ID selectors are for selecting elements by IDs. So I'm going to give this h1, actually no, I'm going to give this div an ID of intro. Okay? And now to select that div with the ID of intro, I'm going to write hashtag intro. Hashtag intro. Hashtag ID name. And let's give it a padding of 50 pixels. Okay, so it's nice and big now. So far, so good. Now, what's the difference between class and ID? Classes, the class attribute, can be applied to as many different elements as you'd like. We could have 10, 12, 20 elements with the class of zebra on my HTML. However, there can only be one element with the ID of intro. Okay? Put another way, and listen closely. Any element can have a class and or an ID. Any element can have a class and or an ID. In fact, any element can have multiple classes or multiple IDs. Well, not multiple IDs. It's possible, but you would never do it. Any element can have multiple classes. Any element can have an ID. But each unique ID is only going to be applied to one element, one specific element. There's only going to be one element with the ID of intro. And there might only be one element with the ID of my name. And there should only be one element with the ID of contact. But they could all have a class of zebra. Zebra could be applied to 12 different elements. Or we could have a whole extra class, a class of elephant. Maybe the other LIs have a class of elephant, both of them. Okay? IDs only exist, unique IDs are only exist on one element. Classes can be given to as many elements as you'd like. We select classes with dot class name in CSS, and we select IDs with hashtag intro in CSS. Now I ask you, what does this select? This selects the one element with the ID of intro. All div elements in your HTML, all elements with the class of zebra, the one element with the ID of intro. Okay, now that we've got that down, the basics, we know that the most general selector, CSS selector, is an element or type selector. Then we have class selectors, and the most specific is going to be an ID selector. Let's take a look at some more complex selectors. What about div.box? What does that select? We know .box is a class selector, but what does div.box select? This selects all divs with the class of box. What about div space dot box? This selects all elements with the class of box which are inside of divs. And back at the beginning, we have dot box, which selects all elements with the class of box. Okay, these are the three patterns. In addition to understanding the three different types of CSS selectors, these are the three patterns of CSS selectors that I want you to be familiar with after this week. Okay? CSS selectors can get quite complicated, but I want you to understand that div.box is more specific than .box. We could have divs with a class of box, h1s with a class of box, paragraphs with a class of box, and they'll all be selected by this selector. This selector, however, will only select div elements which have the class of box. This will only select h1 elements which have the class of box. Okay? And then this final one is simply to indicate that the space in CSS selectors is used to go inside of elements. This is looking for what this selects inside of what this selects. So, all elements with the class of box inside of all div elements. I hope that makes sense. The last thing I want to talk to you about with regards to classes and IDs is often you're going to see elements with multiple classes in the HTML. In fact, you've definitely already seen some, but probably weren't aware. So if I wanted this first LI to have a class of both zebra and both elephant, let's give elephant, let's make it do something. Dot elephant. Let's have it underline everything. Text decoration, underline. Okay, so now we have bold, underline, underline. I want this first LI to be both bold and underlined. But this paragraph, which also has the class of zebra, I don't want to be underlined. What's the significance of that? Well, that means that I can't simply add text decoration, underline, to my zebra selector, because my name is Evan is now underlined. I want this, where we have bold and underlined, underlined not bold, underlined not bold, but I don't want this. So, rather than mess with the CSS, I want to apply both of these classes, zebra and elephant, to this first link. So how do I add a second class to this first LI? I want you to pause here and take a couple minutes and try and Google the solution for this. How to add a second class to an element. How to add multiple classes to an element. The most common responses I see from students. Actually, no, go ahead and pause first. Okay, and now you're back. I hope. The most common responses I see from students are as follows. Class equals zebra, and then class equals elephant. Two class attributes. That is incorrect. You will never see two of the same attribute inside a single tag. That is not correct. The other most common response I see is zebra, comma, elephant. This is also incorrect, but it is closer. The way to give this first list item the class of zebra and the class of elephant is to simply separate them with a space inside our class attribute value. Class equals zebra space elephant. Now, at this point in time, this list item has a class of zebra and it has a class of elephant. That is important. It doesn't have a class of zebra elephant. It has a class of zebra and a class of elephant. Two separate class names. Now if I reload my page, it works. This is no longer underlined. This is underlined and bold. This is underlined. This is underlined. We're good to go. Okay? We're going to spend a lot more time on CSS selectors and how CSS really works behind the scenes in a bit. But for now, this will constitute one of your most important takeaways for this week. The 3 types of CSS selectors and starting to wrap your brain around complex selectors, compound selectors. If you find it very challenging, if you find you need some help, please don't forget that at the Codify Academy Learn page, on the home page, there is a CSS Selector Interpreter inside the Helpful Links section here at the bottom. So I'm going to open that up and show you how to use it. This is all we have. But if I type div in here and select interpret, it tells me exactly what that selector selects. If I write .box and hit interpret, any element with the class of box, it tells me what it selects. If I write div.box, any div element with the class of box. If I write div space .box, any element with the class of box which is inside of any div element. Okay? And lastly, hashtag elephant, the element with the ID of elephant. Okay, so please use this tool. Take advantage of it if you find CSS selectors to be confusing to you at this point in time. They will become much clearer very quickly, organically, as you get more code under your belt.